Hello, hello, and welcome to today's panel session on DEI in Action, a conversation with practitioners and leaders. We are so happy to have you here, and it's so wonderful to see everyone as you come in. My name is Sherry Nassim, and I am the CEO of Center for Executive Excellence. We are a global executive coaching and consultancy organization based in San Diego, California, and we are thrilled that you are joining us today for this fascinating panel discussion. With well over 2,900 registrants from around the world, this is by far the largest audience we've had for these quarterly panel discussions, where we hold space to further diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And as we all gather, we would love to hear from you in the chat. We treat these events as community builders. So let us know where you're from. Share your LinkedIn profile if you like. Let us know what organization you're with, or if you're between roles, that's awesome too. If you know of any open roles in DEI, please share that in the chat as well so that we can help spread the word and accelerate the path for people who want to contribute their talents. As you're doing that, I want to go over some housekeeping so that help you have the very best possible experience in your time together. So first, we encourage you to edit your name and your pronouns, just like I did in my Zoom box. So you just click on those three dots in the upper right corner. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, by the way. We've also reserved 30 minutes at the end of the panel discussion to take your questions. So please, if you would like to ask questions of the panel, please put those in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen so that everyone would have the ability to see your questions. And we've turned on the ability to upvote on those questions so that those are the ones most likely for the panel to address during that last half-hour window. Our team will be dropping hyperlinks to supplemental information in the chat room, and we encourage you to do the same. Help us all continue to build awareness. We'll share both a recording of this panel discussion and a transcript from the chat with all of you as soon as we can turn that around. And if you're not already signed up, my colleague Danielle Aguas at the end of the panel discussion will tell you about how to register for the Deeper Dive half-day event that we have scheduled for tomorrow. And we have some seats open, and we're going to be offering you a discount for joining us tomorrow if you can do that. You'll get to hear keynotes during that half-day discussion tomorrow from Terrell Fletcher, former NFL running back. Also our own scholar in residence, Dr. Tony Barron, who has a double doctorate in psychology and theology, will be speaking. I'll be giving a talk on the neuroscience of bias, and Sarah Hassaine, who you'll meet on today's panel, will be leading a workshop on how to get traction with DEI at your organization. So we certainly welcome you to join us for that as well if you can. Before I introduce our panelists, I just wanted to say that we started these events last year in response to the death of George Floyd. We wanted to use our platform as a space to learn, to share, to build community. For me personally, I wanted to unwind my internalized perception of the world and to help other nascent allies to the best of my ability to do the same. So the fact that you signed up and showed up en masse like this is life. So thank you. So thank you again for being here. Thank you also to our esteemed panelists for sharing your time and expertise with this community. I can't wait for you to meet this amazing group of people. So let's get to it, shall we? First up is Arthur Benjamin, our moderator. Arthur is the Senior Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Tinuiti, the largest independent performance marketing firm focused on every aspect of the customer journey across the quadruple of Google, Facebook/Instagram, Amazon, Apple, and beyond. This multiple award-winning company has over $2 billion in digital media under management and well over 750 employees across the United States. So hello, my friend Arthur. Next, we have Markus Achord. Markus serves as the head of diversity, inclusion, and belonging at Sunrun, the leader in home solar panel and battery storage with over 10,000 employees nationwide. Markus is also a course facilitator for the Cornell University Diversity and Inclusion Certificate Program, and he served a combined 21 years in the U.S. Navy and Navy Reserve. So, Markus, thank you for your service and welcome to you. Next, we have Monica Davy. Monica is the Chief Culture, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer at Vizient, the nation's leading healthcare performance improvement company, with 4,000 employees across 20 metropolitan areas across the United States. Monica guides Vizient's overarching strategy, program implementation, and ongoing support for the company's culture and D&I initiatives. Hello, Monica. Sarah Hassaine serves as the Global Director of Diversity at ResMed, a med tech company based here in San Diego. At ResMed, Sarah is focused on building a global strategy, expanding their ERGs or employee resource groups, and working closely with their leaders across all verticals. As an aside, we'd like to send our early congratulations to Sarah for graduating next month with her executive MBA from the Wharton School, UPenn. Yay! Awesome. Congrats. Armond Kinsey is the Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Atlantic Health System, where he's charged with leading a transformational agenda to infuse diversity and inclusion throughout the organization. In addition to diversity and inclusion, Armond oversees learning and development for 17,000 plus team members across 400 plus sites of care. Hello, Armond. And Dr. Samira Salem serves as the Vice President, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for CUNA, the Credit Union National Association. It's a Madison, Wisconsin-based trade association for both state and federally chartered credit unions located in the United States. CUNA provides member credit unions with trade association services such as lobbying, regulatory advocacy, professional development, and professional services management. Welcome, Samira. And with that, it is my honor and privilege to turn this program over to you, Arthur, and our esteemed panel.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I am so excited to be here today, finally, with my colleagues, to have such a worthwhile conversation and discussion around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I feel as though I've said this to you all before. I feel as though you guys are my BFFs. And so I'm so excited to have this opportunity to connect with you in this space. We're going to go ahead and jump right into our discussion because we know that there's much to discuss. My first question will begin with Markus. And the question is, where does diversity, equity, and inclusion belong in the organizational structure today? Should this be something that is relegated to the HR department? What are your thoughts on that, Markus?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I think I'll start with saying I don't know that there's a right answer for every organization. I think every organization needs to look at what their priorities are, what their focus is. I know the trendy answer is it should not be in HR. And when I saw the question where it said relegated to HR, I'm like, I'm sensing a little bit of a bias there. You know, I think it depends on the organization. I think you need to look at what is your focus, what do you want to work on. For me, my preference is to be part of the HR organization because my priority is looking at people, processes, and systems. You know, I want to look at, you know, how can we ensure more equity in our hiring process and our performance review process. So making sure there's equitable opportunities for everyone there. So I think it's easier when you're part of the HR organization to do that. You know, there's still a focus on supplier diversity, which is in purchasing. You know, how do we reach our customers through marketing and external outreach, and in my organization, especially public policy. What are we doing within the communities? So I think all of that's extremely important. But for me, the priority is we got to get our own house in order. We got to make sure we are a great place to work, that we are diverse, that we have an inclusive workforce. And so for me, that's what I think it belongs in HR. That's my preference. I also, one last thing I'll say, what one thing I've noticed in doing this work is, we try to do it all. We try to do every range of the work. And what I've seen with some DEI teams and professionals is they hit that internal roadblock, right? So then their energy goes to external. Like, I'm going to spend my time external because I'm hitting these roadblocks internally. And so, I would encourage everyone to fight through those roadblocks. That's why we're within the organization, to try to change the culture. So again, I don't know if there is a right answer, but I know when I'm looking for a role, I want to be part of the HR team, since they're the ones developing and rolling out those processes.
I definitely appreciate that insight, Markus. Samira, do you have anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, definitely. And, I have to start off by saying that I've got to agree with Markus that, every organization is going to approach this differently. And you really, it really, the nuance in how you approach this depends on how your organization is set up. For me, whether it's a chief diversity officer, whether it's the vice president of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is my role, this work is about behavioral change. It's about process change. It's about systems change. And, yes, it's about organizational culture as well, and how you do business. So the internal and the external, it's cross-cutting work. And I think a lot of the arguments as to why, folks have pushed back about it being in HR is, depending on your organization, you oftentimes don't have that wide purview and the space to be able to do this holistic work in the way it needs to be done. And so, best practices are that this position reports to either the CEO or somebody in the C-suite. Now, again, very nuanced as to whether you are reporting to the CEO. It's really, again, a matter of access to leadership in that respect, right? I personally report to our COO, but I have easy access to our CEO. I have him on speed dial. If I need to get a hold of him, he's there, right? And there are regular check-ins, that sort of thing. I think that's important, and that's absolutely key. You've got to have the ability to have that easy access to leadership.
I absolutely agree with that, Samira. I think that's incredible insight, that how important it is for access. And I think that's the key word, to make sure that if your work is going to be successful, you have to have access. Monica, would you have anything to add?
Sure. I'm just going to harp on the access thing. I think that no matter where your box is, right? So, because sometimes we get hung up on org structure and boxes. I've worked in multiple organizations where I reported to the head of the organization, and I currently work in an organization where I report to the chief people officer. Access is critical, because you can report to the CEO or the president of the company or the head of an agency and still not have that access, right? And so it's the leadership commitment and the access that's critically important, because access without leadership commitment is still not going to get you anywhere, right? So I think it's critically important. My personal preference, I think I agree with Markus and Samira that it depends on the organization, but for me, it's about the maturity of the organization, right? And where they are in their DEI journey. I'm one of these over-the-top diversity people that believe you give me a problem, I can solve it with diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So I think it's critical when we do our work to align it with the mission of whatever organization we're with. And if your organization is on the very mature end of the spectrum, then you're going to be up there reporting to the CEO, because it's not going to just be about HR and people. It's going to be about your bottom line and how you get business done, right? So for the company that I work for right now, We are there to help the healthcare industry perform better, right? And if you're not thinking about the diversity of patients and delivering healthcare, you're going to miss the mark, right? So for my current organization, although I'm under the Chief People Officer, I'm in all those spaces because I believe that diversity, equity, inclusion with a proper strategic focus, it can solve a whole lot of your business challenges.
Absolutely amazing addition, Monica. I do have a follow-up question for the three of you. Any of you can chime in. How important do you think it is for leadership buy-in? We're talking about access. We're talking about, where we report, organizational structure. How important do you think leadership buy-in is to the success of diversity and inclusion?
So I'll go. I think it's critical. I don't think you can get far. Not even far, you can't get anywhere without it, right? And we all know, and I'm preaching to the choir here, right? It's not always easy to get the leadership from the commitment from the top, but most of the time that's where we start. It's that middle managers, right? We call it the frozen middle in the diversity space where it's hard to trickle down. So that's where our work really comes in a lot, right? If you've got the CEO or the president or the head of the agency commitment, it's convincing that middle manager who's responsible for the day-to-day work, making sure that they're committed, because that's where the rubber meets the road, right? People know that the talking head, the CEO, they're going to say the right things. They're going to say they're committed. But when it comes to how people are treated and how we get our work done, that's the middle manager that's critical, right? So I would say not only C-suite leadership is important, but trickle down to the middle manager as well.
Great, Monica. Markus, Samira, you have anything?
Yeah, I would add on to what Monica said. I mean, going back to access, it's, again, wherever your role is, it's access, unfettered access to people who make those decisions. And to Monica's point, but it's also getting those leaders to help you push that message down so that they say, yes, we believe this, but how do you get them to let those in the next rungs down know that it's a priority for them as well? So yeah, 100% Monica.
Thank you, Markus. Anything, Samira, or you're good?
I was thinking hallelujah as Monica was speaking about the middle managers. I think it is a challenge. A lot of the conversation is about getting, the leadership to buy in, and how do you do it? And I think there's been a lot of conversation about, well, there are different ways to appeal to leadership, right? If you're a mission-driven organization or a mission-driven industry, such as credit unions, right? We've got a values case that is incredibly strong in terms of why we do this work, right? But there's also that bottom line, and you can't forget about that. And so appealing to leadership means really keying in on what it is that the leadership of your industry, of your organization is, what's going to appeal to them, right? And in our case, credit unions, it is certainly the values case. We can't forget the business case. And we are a trade association, so we also think about advocacy in our regulators. There is an important case there. So if you bring that all together, certainly that speaks to top leadership, but when we're talking to middle level leadership, it's important to also think about what their goals are and connect, right, the impact of DEI and how that helps them achieve their goals where they're at. So I think we always have to keep that in mind. We can't assume that it's going to be kind of trickle down, from the top, directed, and people are going to buy in. So I completely agree. And I don't think we give enough attention to those middle managers. So thank you, Monica, for bringing up that point.
Yeah. All right. Can I just say one more thing about the buy-in? That, buy-in, sometimes it looks like a commitment statement, right? Or you ask your CEO to speak about it. I say we take it a step further, and this is something I love about what I'm doing in my company right now, that your C-suite leaders allow them to own certain aspects of your diversity program, right? So we're not the only ones out there speaking about what we need to accomplish, but actually have them own it and be held accountable for meeting those goals that you have around your diversity initiatives.
That's very insightful, Monica. Wow, I love that idea. Let's go on to our next question. Question number 2, Armond, we will begin with you, is what are 2 areas you are focused on in your 2021 diversity and inclusion strategy? And what actions are you taking to move the needle in your organization or industry?
Thanks, Art. And I'm just going to piggyback on what Monica just said, because it's a great segue into what I tend to share is around that accountability. So as a vice president and CDO, I don't own diversity inclusion for 17,000 people. They own it for themselves, and leaders need to own it for their departments and or divisions. So, I've been at this organization for 2 years. I have a very committed C-suite to the point where this year, when we laid out our goals, diversity and inclusion language is all throughout those goals. So you want to talk about accountability? Well, it's now tied to your bonus and your compensation. So, those are, some of the aspirational goals that we were able to get really quickly. So there's 2 areas that we're focusing on this year. I'll share 2 of them. One is increasing diversity for our administrative leadership, but also for our physician leadership. So we all know coming out of COVID that Black and Brown communities were hit relatively harder than some other communities. We have an obligation to develop that talent. We have an obligation to develop our upcoming administrative professionals, our physicians, our residents, et cetera. And one of my pet peeves is for somebody to tell me I can't find diverse talent. Give me a few minutes, I can help you find it. We're there, we're out there. And I think you have to be intentional about how and where we want to find the talent. For the first time in our healthcare system, we are starting to partner with HBCUs. It's a source that had been historically untapped for us because, you get your residents, you get your fellows in, they come through their medical program. So for the first time in the fall, we'll have an oncology resident spending time with us from Morehouse. So it's just opening the doors and allowing access, I think, will be key. We're also expanding, how do we reach out to interns and start those early careers as soon as possible. So excited to get that going. We're also looking at internal mobility. So not just who we're bringing in the door, but what are the development opportunities for our underserved communities, our communities of color, who are already in our system? Do they get the same development opportunities as their majority? The other piece that we are focusing on this year is expanding our modalities of communication. So I work for a health system. We have 7 hospitals. One of the things that COVID exposed for us is our inability to communicate in broad languages. When COVID hit, information was hitting us at rapid speed. And we really needed to figure out how do we develop platforms to communicate to a broad and diverse communities. So our website is now being translated into multiple languages. And as a trickle effect, when people go to set up an appointment for a vaccine, before COVID, it was only in English. So how do we, close some of those social determinants of health and health disparities by directly giving consumers, who are now our patients, access to be able to make those appointments in their preferred language. And so we're looking at accessibility across the board. And I think one of the things that'll help us get there is also certifying our own team members to be interpreters within our organization. We know patients are shopping, hospitals like they do department stores. So they're becoming consumers of healthcare. They want to compare your doctors. They want to shop for the best. They want convenience. So we need to meet them where they are. So those are 2 of the ones I'll share today, but it's tons we can do. But I think if you tie it to metrics, anything's possible.
Those are absolutely amazing, Armond. Thank you so much for sharing just those 2 as a part of what I know is a much larger strategy for you. Sarah, would you like to share? We can't hear you, Sarah.
Is that better?
There you are.
Sorry about that. We're talking a little bit about access earlier, and kind of going back to when you're going to take a step back and think about your strategy, understanding where your leaders are at and where your stakeholders are at and what their relationship is with inclusion and diversity is so important. I think starting with listening and understanding just the overall foundation. What do your stakeholders understand of what inclusion building looks like? What does fostering diversity mean, and which one comes first? I like to say that we really have to focus on what will it take for us to have inclusive policies and practices in place before we really are intentional about building diversity. So when it comes to our strategy, the two things I'm prioritizing right now are focusing on awareness. What does inclusion and diversity mean? What does it mean across all business verticals, whether it's products, whether it's policies, benefits, effective management skills, community outreach, employer brand. All of that is what D&I touches. And so it's a holistic approach to business. Secondly, the second one is sourcing and hiring. So now that we're focusing on inclusion, understanding what leading inclusively looks like and what that means across the business, then we take a step back and think, how are we sourcing our talent? You know, what Armond said is my pet peeve as well. When I have people that come and say, well, I don't know, I want talent, I just can't find it. It goes back to the challenge of speed. Our recruiters have too many open requisitions. We have to get butts in seat really fast. How can we balance out and expand our sourcing strategy because the talent is there? And so being really intentional with the right partnerships. So in terms of actions that we're putting into place right now is finding these internal and external partnerships. I look at all of us on this panel, we are consultants to our stakeholders. We are helping them drive the business. And so what are the right partners internally and how can we leverage external vendors right now that are out there with databases, with partnerships, with talent in order for us to exceed? So in addition to partnerships, I would also say community building internally is the second part of the strategy. You really have to focus on your shop inside before you really look outward. And so I've been focusing on building employee resource groups, mosaic groups, bringing employees together, creating that sense of employee engagement, pride, and that also helps with recruiting. When you have strong employee resource groups, they can do a lot of community outreach and a lot of recruiting for you. And so your best asset is your talent. And that's the best tool that you can use to also attract new talent. So those are kind of the priorities right now for me, in addition to rolling out trainings enterprise-wide that focus on the fundamentals of D&I.
Absolutely insightful. Thank you so much, Sarah. Markus, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, a couple of things that we're working on. Number one, sort of what, along the lines of what Sarah mentioned, it's how do we expand our external partnerships? You know, as we're in the renewable energy industry, so how do we tap into communities and talk to them about coming into this industry because there's so much growth. There's so much growth in solar and all renewable energy. So how do we reach into communities and say, hey, come join us. This is what our roles are like. And much like, as Sarah mentioned, it's leveraging our ERGs to kind of do some outreach to say, hey, come join this great organization. So that's one. And the second is expanding who we reach with all of our content and programming and everything that we do. I think I learned early on in doing this work, and if I filled the conference room with 300 people, I got really excited. I'm like, we're reaching some people, we're doing some things. And then you take a step back and you're like, month after month, it's 80% the same people who are showing up for things. And we're an organization of 10,000. So how do we create content that reaches a broader audience? And so that's something we're working on. COVID obviously, changed the dynamic a little bit, but also just in our organization, we're people meeting at a depot and then going to climb on customers' roofs and like, how do you get content to them and also hear about how they're feeling, if the culture is right for them. And so we're doing a lot of work there to figure out how do we, and we've had some great calls. We've had 500 people on a WebEx call on a Google Meet, which is phenomenal. But again, we're 10,000 employees now. So how do we get that out there? So really excited about that challenge and see how we do more there.
Absolutely great ad. Thank you so much, Markus, for sharing. We're going to go ahead to our third question, and we're going to begin our third question with Samira. Our third question is, as a practitioner, how important is creating psychological safety and trust in your DEI work? how does psychological safety and trust impact one of these areas or any of these areas within D&I?
Mm-hmm. That's a really great question. I think it's absolutely vital to our DEI work. We know that there's tons of research out there that shows that diverse and inclusive teams outperform homogenous teams every day of the week. But the caveat is that these teams have got to be well managed. And part of that being well managed is ensuring that there is psychological safety and that there's trust there. The psychological safety and trust, what it does is it allows folks to take risks, allows them to be innovative. It allows them to bring their authentic selves to work. And it creates that environment where you don't feel like you're going to be punished for going out on a limb or for making a mistake. And you need to have this kind of environment if you're going to create a culture of inclusion, if you're going to have, folks feel like they can fully contribute to the mission of an organization, feel like they're part of cultural transformation, which is part of this project, part of the work that we're doing here. And it means that this work means that we are shifting away from this kind of dominant culture where you've got the in-group, that's sort of prioritized. And you need folks to feel like, even if they're not in the dominant culture, the dominant group, they feel safe, authentically contributing, and they're not putting their job on the line every time they share their perspective. So it's absolutely critical to our work to be able to provide that kind of environment where people feel safe, psychologically safe, and they've got that trust.
Thank you for sharing, Samira. I really appreciate those insights. Armond, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, just to build off of what was said, I think we can't assume that we'll get there overnight. I think the word itself, psychological safety, is a big word. It's a huge definition. And we don't always know everyone's truth. We have to be very, mindful of where they are on their journey, specific to diversity and inclusion. But, I think we can get there. I think trust is a huge factor in us getting there. And I think part of it is us being willing to be vulnerable in our own work. A lot of companies, as we all know, rush to get out statements around their diversity and inclusion areas for last year, after the killing of George Floyd. But now their companies and the employees are holding them accountable for those statements. What's really being done? Are we living up to what that statement said? And to not do that, it hurts the trust factor. It hurts the ability to build psychological safety. So I think we have to be authentic in that ask. I think when we ask for people's feedback, they need to be able to see their fingerprint in your strategy. If somebody can understand that what they said impressed or had an influence on how you built out your diversity strategy, they're more inclined to trust the fact that this is going to be in my best interest. So I think, as you're building, ask for that feedback and try to incorporate that feedback and make sure people can see their fingerprint in your strategy, in your initiatives, in your program, because those small wins will ultimately help you build that trust and eventually get to that psychological safety.
I absolutely love that, Armond, giving that space for them to get buy-in by being a part of the strategic work, seeing their fingerprints within your strategy. I absolutely love that. And I think that that's a great way of approaching building psychological safety. I want to open it up to any of the other panelists. Do any other panelists want to share on psychological safety and possibly how that plays a role in how you're doing your work at your organizations?
Sure, I can chime in here a little bit. I think that, a lot of organizations after the murder of George Floyd rush to have these listening sessions, right? And to create a safe space for people to come and process what they were feeling, what they were going through. I don't know how many people are still doing that, right? I mean, we did it then because everyone was really upset, and that it wasn't just certain groups of people that were upset, but the pain hit multiple groups. So we had these conversations. I think it's critical for any organization to create a space to have those conversations all the time. The organization that I was in before, National Credit Union Administration, we've been having monthly conversations for about 4 years prior to George Floyd being murdered, right? So when he was murdered, all we had to say was, okay, we're going to address this. And people felt safe because they knew this is a place where they could come, they could share what they were experiencing, raw emotion, be transparent, not afraid to make mistakes. I'm looking at the chat where people are saying, what is psychological safety, right? So not afraid to step into these difficult conversations because we had created a space where people knew that they could be authentic, they could be transparent, but that they could also screw up in language and make mistakes. And it was all about learning. So my hope is that people understand that that kind of practice that many people were doing last year, and I don't think they are continuing, that they should continue doing it, because as we already know, there's going to be more incidences, right? And we need to continue to keep those safe spaces. I had an employee to tell me this week, and it was actually an African-American woman. I don't know why we need to talk about this stuff at work. Why are you forcing us to have these conversations at work? And I asked her, I said, are you saying that these things don't impact you? And she says, yeah, but I leave it at home. And I explained to her the energy that it takes to leave that at the door when you come into your workplace. And that's energy that we could be putting into doing our jobs if we're given a space to process it at work.
I'd like to add too, so I've been holding a few listening sessions after the Atlanta shootings, before the verdict came out, after the verdict came out, and I plan to hold one as a memorial of the year of George Floyd's murder. And I keep seeing increased participation. People come for support, they come to share, or they come to listen. And there's a spectrum of how people are feeling. And the challenge we see now is that there's repeat trauma for a lot of communities because we keep seeing repeat images. So we just have to keep in mind that it's not just psychological safety at work. Like you said, I love what you said, Monica, about the energy we all carry and the pain we're all carrying. And we can't cover that at work. I mean, I love the Deloitte data on covering. I mean, over 50% of ourselves is covered at work, let alone the pain that we're all carrying. So I think that there needs to be more training and healthy conversations at work around what psychological safety means in order to be vulnerable, to be sad, to be happy, to take that time to process. I once attended a talk where the leader said, if you need to go sit in your car, this is pre-COVID, if you need to go sit in your car in the middle of the day just to process, go do that. Like, go do what you need to do, because that does impact how we show up at work. And so at the end of the day, psychological safety, I think, is not getting enough attention, and it should be incorporated like in our trainings, maybe in the beginning when you're onboarded and in a repeat manner.
Absolutely amazing ads, both from Monica and Sarah. Anyone else want to chime in before we go to our next question? All right, we'll go to our next question. Our next question will begin with Monica. And the question is, what areas of DEI do you believe we are not giving enough attention to, but we should be? And what do you think CEOs and DEI leaders should respond to, or how do you think CEOs and DEI leaders should respond to these gaps?
So let me say, I think that we give too much attention sometimes to representational diversity, right? We start off with trying to get the diversity into our organizations. But if you're not focusing on your culture and making sure you have an inclusive culture, that diversity is going to walk right out the door, right? You're going to have that attrition rate is going to continue to stay high, and there's going to be a revolving door. And attrition is expensive, right? So you put all this energy into recruiting and attracting people, and then they leave. So I think that we need to really pay attention to inclusion. I like to say that if you don't intentionally include, you unintentionally exclude, right? And it's not easy. Like, anybody that thinks inclusion is easy is lying. It's not. We all know we have so much that we have to process and do day after day. Our information, our brain is taking in so many pieces of information. Our brains are wired to make quick, exclusive decisions, right? It saves us time, it saves us energy. So you have to slow yourself down and be intentional about inclusion. I love the fact that the company I'm now with, my title is actually Chief Culture, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer. I love the fact that they had the foresight to put those things together, because I could do all this work over here on diversity and inclusion, but if we're not working on our culture, which starts with your values, and it starts with your leadership actually living and behaving those values, you're not going to make any progress. So I think that we need to pay more attention to our organizational culture. Many people have heard the terminology culture eats strategy for lunch, right? You can have the most airtight, perfectly poised strategy, but if your culture is not supportive of that, if you don't have the culture to get you there, you're not going to make a lot of progress. So I say pay more attention to culture and make sure that inclusion is one of those values that you're asking people to live in that culture.
Absolutely amazing, Monica. Thank you so much. Sarah, you have anything to add?
Yeah. So we have to kind of also think about what's your competitive advantage with your D&I strategy, and also what the definition is, kind of going back to the assumption that we tend to think about gender, race, age, sexual orientation, but it's deeper than that. It's neurodiversity, it's your veteran status, it's disability, it's accessibility. So what I think that businesses need to widen their lens when we talk about D&I and think about, well, how are we empowering our veteran? How are we recruiting more from our veteran community? There's a lot of initiatives out there when people separate from the military. How are companies leveraging that talent? Same thing with disability. 1 in 4 people have a disability, but that is the most untapped talent pool out there. That would increase our GDP by an enormous amount. So how are we thinking more strategically about our bottom line, about our people, and about our talent? And I think that if we were to think about diversity and inclusion across the business from the definition that it encompasses, we would have a competitive advantage.
Absolutely insightful, Sarah. Thank you so very much. I want to ask a follow-up question to the panel, and then we'll transition to some Q&A time. I want to ask the question, what would you say are the dangers or the concerns around performative diversity or performative acts of inclusion? I want to throw that out there. That's been a thing that's been kind of being talked about lately as organizations are looking for ways to, again, to tackle this subject. But we don't really talk about sometimes the dangers of having a performative approach to D&I. Anyone want to chime in or give some insight or feedback on that?
So I will, if I'm looking to see if anybody else is unmuting, I'll jump in. I'm assuming what you mean is that those check the box exercises, right? Make it look like we're committed. And I think that the best laid programs or strategies can fall into that if you don't have the right intention. I think when you have the time, and when you think about this DEI work, right, you can't boil the ocean. You have to be patient and understand that you have to have a holistic approach, right? And so I think that if you're given the gift of time, which sometimes we're not, you're hired into these jobs and they want you to fix things quickly. I think they're setting you up for failure if they're asking you to do that. But I think that people have to start with their why, right? It's that own personal work that you have to do individually. We all had to do it as DEI professionals, and you got to do it with your leadership team, right? And so if people can't understand what their why is, even if your why, I had a conversation with the manager the other day. If your why is that our CEO is committed and therefore you have to be, own that, right? But you have to go on your own personal journey about why you're committed to this work. Or it's all going to be performative art, right? It's all going to be check the box and it's not going to be sustainable. And so I think it's important to meet people where they are, understand people are at different places, but understanding your why, having a personal why about why you're committed to this will make almost anything you do not performative because you're going to be doing it for the right reasons.
Absolutely amazing, Monica. Anyone else?
I just want to add to something Monica said. Something I like to talk about in my trainings I'll joke and, say D&I is not just important for the business, right? It's for your team. It's actually for you. And understanding your own values, your own moral compass, who you are, is really going to help you in your own personal D&I journey. And so I always invite people who are in my trainings to just take a week to observe yourself, to learn more, to be more curious, to be open-minded, and understand what inclusion means to you, understand your own biases, and just introduce them to these concepts, but make the relationship personal. It's not about the organization. It's not even about how you're navigating society. Make it about you. But Arthur, to your question, I do worry that now companies, it's a checkbox. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see about 10, 15 years from now, how companies fare. Because there's a 71% increase in D&I professionals. So many of us are strategizing like we are today, but they also say that over 50% of us will fail. So it's really interesting to see who's not just checking the box. And I think it's the hardest time right now to be a leader, because you have to be agile, you have to be open-minded, and be able to lean in and keep up with all these things that are happening. And I'm just curious to see what's going to happen.
Yeah, Sarah, so am I. There's this nervousness around whether or not some of our D&I work, because of George Floyd, great motivation or great perspective. I think it's good that some people are trying to have it now, but I oftentimes wonder whether or not it is, as Monica stated, a check the box or a performative act because of what's going on. Do any of our other panelists want to chime in before we go to our Q&A?
I would just agree with what was said. I think we often marry diversity and inclusion together. And I think it's very important that we know that work is, helps each other. They're two different arms of the work. To Monica's point, the diversity, that's happening. We're in a world that's more diverse than ever. Getting the diverse talent, it takes some effort, absolutely. Keeping the diverse talent is a job in itself. There's a statistic that says within the first 30 to 60 days of talent walking in your door, they're deciding if they're going to stay. So outside of if they love their job, how well are you connecting them to the community? How well are you connecting them to your internal community? And to Monica's point, it costs an organization 1.5 times that person's salary to replace them. So do we want to find the right talent, the right time up front, or waste that time, reinvesting in sourcing, recruiting, and now trying to find the right person again? I would also caution people for trying to find talent that fits the organization. Look for talent that aligns to your organization. I don't want to fit into anybody's box. And when you come to our organization, I'm hiring you because you have a breadth of experiences and talents and everything else that comes with you. I don't want you to leave that at the door, and then now you think you have to adapt to everything that we believe. That's the opposite of diversity. So, you want the alignment, of course. You want somebody that believes in your mission and vision, but you want them to bring their entire and authentic selves when they walk in your door. And I think that will also help with your retention.
I love that, Armond. Samira?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in here. It makes me of this idea of transactional work versus transformational work. And I think if it's going to be sustainable, it's not checkbox work. It is that transformational work where we're talking about transforming systems, but that's also married with the transformation that has to happen at the individual level. So I think it kind of connects to certainly what Sarah was saying, Monica and Armond. I think part of what makes me nervous about, for example, putting forward simply a business case for this work is that the business case can lead us to that more transactional type of work, right? We're doing it because it is going to be better for our bottom line, right? It's not immediately better for your bottom line, typically. I mean, it takes time, it takes work. There will be mistakes along the way. You need to be able to pick yourself back up and push forward. And that's where that commitment from the top, that sort of unwavering commitment, and that why that Monica was talking about, you got to have that North Star, is going to keep pushing you forward to do the sorts of deep work that needs to happen to push through those roadblocks, to push through those barriers, and to have the kind of management of that diverse talent and that culture that's going to give you, in the end, your organization, your employees, and your, whether they're members or their customers, their clients, whatever you call them, your community, the benefits. So I think that's what gets us to moving away from this sustainability, all the different elements that these amazing experts have been talking about are part and parcel of what it's going to take to get away from that sort of more checkbox mentality, which is easy, and you know, people have their Gantt charts and whatever, and not that it's easy, but it is, you can understand it, right? You can and it's linear. This work is not linear. It builds and it goes in circles and cycles, and you come back and you got to start over again and go deeper. And it's just incredibly complex. But if we want to survive, if we want to push forward and see the humanity and see the value and reap the value for our organizations, we've got to do this work.
To all of our panelists, this has been an incredible conversation. This has been an incredible discussion. Thank you so much to all of you for such incredible insight. You are all clearly highly respected thought leaders in this space. I am honored to call all of you friends and colleagues. And so at this point in our session, I will turn this back over to Sherry, who will be managing and handling our questions and answers.
Oh my goodness. I am, my mute button was on, but I was back and going, yes, oh yes, yes. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. And I can imagine with over thousands of people in the room at the same time, this would have been a really, really noisy event if we didn't have our mute buttons on. But wow, this is like getting this many brains, you know, in the Zoom room at the same time and getting this specific. It's like updating our operating system in real time. It's so wonderful. I do a lot of, you know, to Monica's point, I do a lot of culture transformation work, and hopefully, you know, this is all culture transformation. And just 5 years ago, culture fit was what we were talking about. You want people, you know, make sure you've got your culture well in hand, and that just got to be too clicky, right? And so now it's culture add. So wow, I love that. I will not say culture fit again. Thank you for that. I'm blessed. I'm blessed by you. And also thank you to our brilliant Danielle, who suggested that we upvote our Q&A, because otherwise we would be going through, 125 questions to try to figure out what people really want to hear. So I've opened the Q&A section, and I will tell you that looks like the top 2 questions are interesting. The first one is about what advice would you give for someone interested in transitioning into a DEI role without HR experience? I think we do have a lot of people interested in getting into this role. A lot of you are really seasoned practitioners in this area. So for someone who's really interested in adding their talents to this space, what kind of advice would you give for someone interested? And Art, I'm going to ask you as a panelist rather than a moderator, because I know you too have a lot to share in this space. So what are your thoughts on that?
I would say, and I'm sure my colleagues will have their own perspectives on this, but I would say that if you're looking to get in this space, I think first of all, really finding yourself a community that you can learn from who are also doing the work is going to be, to me, astronomically important. I think you want to be hearing and surrounding yourself with other practitioners and other leaders who are doing the work, which is why I'm always excited to be around my colleagues. I think also someone who's interested in this work should look for ways to always be learning. Grab books on diversity and inclusion topics, attend webinars, look for ways in which to always expand or to shape and transform your perspective. It takes time, to me, it takes time to develop a D&I lens and a D&I perspective so that you see things through a D&I scope. And I think that takes time. And I think that surrounding yourself with a community and then being sure that you expand your understanding of diversity and inclusion, your knowledge of diversity and inclusion, whether that's through book reading, webinars, I think are some simple ways to start. if you're looking to move into that space. And then I'll give it over to my other colleagues to see what they want to share.
So can I just say here, this is one of my pet peeves, because I think a lot of companies, when they're ready to start focusing on diversity, and Art knows this is true, right? They find the woman or the Black person or the Hispanic and say, okay, you're responsible for diversity. We would never do that for CFO. We would never do that for IT, right? So I want us all to commit to battling this myth that anybody can do this work as long as you are diverse. First of all, we're all diverse, right? we are all diverse, but getting formal education, because I think you set yourself up for failure if you go in. Now, passion is huge. When I'm looking to hire somebody, I want passion, and you can't teach passion. But there are skills, strategic planning, negotiating skills, presentation skills. There are a ton of skills that go into being an effective DEI professional. And I just think that you do yourself harm if you think that your passion and is enough and doing little things on the side. Look for a formal program. Right now, there are tons of formal programs out there. Cornell, where Markus teaches, is one of the best. I live in Washington, D.C. Georgetown has a fantastic one too. But find formal training, and don't set yourself up for failure thinking that your passion or your lived diverse experience is enough.
Woo.
Yeah,
I would agree. I'm sorry, Sam. You can tell we all have energy around.
We all have passion around it.
It's not a hobby. You can't treat this work as a hobby. We love to have champions and allies, but this is hard work. This is not something that you can do on the side. Now, we absolutely need those allies and champions and BRG leaders, et cetera. Absolutely. But if you're going to decide to really do this work, you have to get the formal training.
Yes.
I'd like to add something, if I may. If you are thinking about that transfer, I think understand your skill sets and what's transferable, right? So, D&I requires a lot of influence, relationship management, persuasion, so writing. A lot of this, understanding your work experience and how that transfers, I think is key, because passion can only get you so far if you don't have the strategic eye and the analysis to understand how am I impacting this business and how am I driving change and how can I do that in an effective way that resonates with my employees and with my leadership. And so it's really a lot of empathy and emotional intelligence that you have to really tap into.
Oh, yeah.
And one thing I want to add, talking about the Cornell program, that's probably the number one question I get asked by the students in those courses. It's again, phenomenal course. It gives you great foundational language and understanding of this work. And the feedback I often give to them is this: put yourself in the hiring manager's position. I'm either going to look for someone who has this experience doing this work, or I'm going to look within my own organization, who's someone who knows the organization, and I can help them learn to be a DEI professional. And that's what I've done at my company. I hired an IT project manager who was phenomenal, and now one of the best DEI managers I've ever seen. So my recommendation to people is, within where you are today, look for those opportunities to lead an ERG, take on a project. I've got someone internally now she's reached out. She said, hey, I just want to take on some projects. So she's doing some project work, and she's already getting contacted by companies like, hey, I see you've done some DEI work, even though she's not in a DEI position. And if you are looking to make that jump now, jump into another company doing what your experience is. Spend 6 months, building up your own cachet, and then once you're in there, say, hey, I'd love to do some DEI work. So just trying to keep it real that, if I got a choice between somebody who doesn't have the experience or teaching someone internally how to do this work, that's probably the path I would go.
I love that. I've been hearing lots of pet peeves in the last couple of weeks from the tech rehearsal that we did to this, and I love it. It's really complex. I do a ton of work in my organization, teamwork, culture transformation, one-on-one coaching, but this is a space that I'm just slow walking into because it's fraught, with potential for just making things worse rather than making things better. So thank you. Those were excellent. And the other, top question here is, and I think this is also, a lot of people are facing this. What tips do you have for handling people who are actively against DEI initiatives within the organization? Like their mindset is misaligned. Are there moments when this indicates the person should be fired? Was part of that question. And people are asking, senior leadership was vehemently against DEI. So what do you do with that? Active resistance. Go ahead, Markus.
Yeah, we get, as you might imagine, as we're sharing different communications, we get that we come out with some very troubling statements. And for us, is this something that needs to be referred as a case for employee relations? Was it just someone sharing an opinion that we may not agree with, but it's not a danger, to the organization or to others? It's like you identify who those people are. You make sure they're not in a position to impact someone else's career, to cause harm. Reach out with them, trying to build that bridge. And probably, more than once I've had to say, it sounds like your values don't align with this company's values. Mm-hmm. And I encourage you to find a place that does. Mm-hmm. When I was at a previous company, our CEO said, we invite you to become a customer, basically, because you're probably not the best employee for this organization. So, I think it's being real. It's how do we identify those individuals? Make an effort to work with them. But if not, let's figure out how to find another role for them.
Mm-hmm. Sarah?
It's kind of like the 80-20 rule. The goal is not to have 100% conversion. It's always, you're going to have an 80-20, maybe it's a 90-10, maybe it's 50-50. In my experience in D&I, there will always be objections or concerns or thoughts about the strategy or discomfort around what's happening. And a lot of times we know this, sometimes it just comes from not knowing, not understanding. And so trying to create the space to listen and just validate, but also what Markus said, this is the company's values. So it's not about acquiescing or shifting. It's more about, we hear you, thank you. I always say, I'd rather get those complaints and know what I want them to be vocal as opposed to not be vocal. I would be more concerned if there was pretend to be this silent, that everyone was on board, because everyone's not on board. And that's okay. That's why we're here. So I actually welcome those conversations, and I just say thank you so much. And I'm here if you want to be heard again.
I completely agree with Sarah on that. It is when people are vocal and clear, you can have those kinds of conversations. And what's incredibly helpful is if you have your values laid out clearly. One of our values that we just added was inclusive, and we had our staff help us to define, what do we mean by that? What does this mean to you? What are the actions? What are the behaviors that align with being inclusive? And all of that is connected to people's performance management, right? One of the behaviors we expect is inclusive. So absolutely, having those sorts of conversations, ensuring that people understand what the expectations are, and then if they can't meet the expectations, well then maybe values don't align. So
I was just going to add that part of being inclusive is appreciating that everybody's not going to agree, right? And it may be the lawyer in me, but whenever I present, and especially if I get people at the end who aren't asking me questions, I push and I pull on those people to try to get those people who disagree with me, right? Who disagree with, why do we have to spend so much time talking about this? I want to hear from them because they help me sharpen my arguments, right? Yeah. And it helps me figure out how to convince other people. So I like to spend most of my time with the naysayers, right? Part of me is maybe because I think I can convince them, right? But the other part is I think it makes me sharper as a diversity professional because I can understand what I need to speak to, and there are a lot more people that feel like that aren't speaking out, right? And I need to figure out how to reach those people as well.
Mm-hmm.
And can I just add, just really quick on the back of Monica, that's my perspective also. When we have leadership, executive leadership who are against it, I enjoy that. I like pressing into that and listening. Those are the people, like Monica said, I spend my time with. My calendar be full with those people, because I do believe that maybe their objection to D&I, it may reveal a blind spot in my presentation, or maybe there's something I didn't think about in how I presented it, or the questions I answered. I also do like the challenge of convincing them and getting them over, and then they're allies. And then you have the awesome story that someone who opposed you is now an ally. So I do like that, but I actually do believe that again, the part of inclusion is letting that person who feels as though they are not interested in the work, making them feel, hey, this is about you too. This is about your voice mattering and us hearing your voice. Now, at the end of the day, if you won't change and align with the organizational values, then that's a different conversation. But I want you to feel like along the way, you still felt like your voice was being heard. And so for me, that's my perspective on it.
Absolutely.
I agree. I think if you're going to talk inclusion, we have to listen to those naysayers. We can't talk the language of inclusion, but we can only talk to those that, think, act, look, talk like that. The challenge does become if it's disruptive to the business, or in my case, if it's disruptive to patient care, then that's a separate conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't spend as much time with those naysayers. I grew up in these years, and I'm from the Deep South. And so I want to talk to you. I want to understand why you feel this way. I want to try to win you over. But I also believe there's 60% of the population who just aren't involved, who don't get it. And that's where I end up spending my time and my energy. Mm-hmm. Like the naysayers and the really strong, I want to identify them. I want to ask the questions, but I'm not going to put a whole lot of energy into you when there's a large percent of the population that I feel is close. Like they're close. I just need to help them understand their part in this and how they do play a part, and how do I get them moving. So I'm not spending all my time with those naysayers.
All right. So if you're working with a company that Markus is at, put your question in the box, and we may or may not get to it, but be sure to ask your question. I love that. Here's another. Oh, I like this one too. I'm big into metrics. So Letitia Bryant said, I'm always interested in metrics to measure the effectiveness of DEI initiatives. Will the panelists share some metrics that you use in your organizations? Great question, Letitia.
So we just recently did one where we did a culture survey. Mm-hmm. And, culture is about how people experience your organization, right? And so one of the metrics that we looked at was based on race and gender, how are different people experiencing the company, right? So that's a metric that you start with, that you're trying to solve for, right? Mm-hmm. And like many companies, we saw some things, right? That women feel differently about some issues than men, and people of color feel differently about some issues than other groups, right? So that's a metric that we're using, and we're going to do all this culture work and then keep checking on it to see if we can narrow that gap, because mm-hmm. we want all employees to experience the company the same way. Right. So that's just one piece of it. And then there is, using surveys and creating what we used to have called an inclusion index that measured certain things about how people feel included. Mm-hmm.
So we also do an engagement survey, and great data comes from that. Last year, I cross-referenced that with some of our patient data, because we do patient satisfaction surveys, and also cross-referenced it with our performance management data. So what that told me is that people's perception versus what's actually happening in the performance management process is not aligned. So, just to give you an example, we have about 30% of our organization identifies as African-American. However, they were about 47% of people being written up for performance plans. So when you look at the data, it can tell you a whole story, and it can also make you have to shift to what your priorities should be. So that helped us create a whole platform or program around how are we addressing performance management, and is it an equitable process?
Wow. Wow, that's really powerful. I love that.
So look at data to get to the questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because your data is going to tell you a whole lot.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else, Sarah? I know you're a data person.
Yeah, data drives your strategy and tells the story. So we also do an engagement survey twice a year. And I'm actually in the process of slicing and dicing our data by region, by leader, and that's going to help inform my strategy to know, like, maybe in this part of the world, we're going to focus on this, or these are some of the feedback I'm getting here. D&I looks differently around the world, and the definition shifts. And so making sure that I alter and I tailor appropriately. With that said, I'm also asking for us to start measuring more. Like, I'm really interested in the candidate experience. Who's applying, who's not applying, who are we phone screening, who are we not phone screening, and really tracking everything. When do they drop out of the loop? Who's on site? Who's accepting? Who's not accepting? Who are we offering things to? And so I would love for us all in the D&I space to become more granular with the data we're collecting. And that's going to help us better understand our businesses and who we're attracting, who's making it in, who's leaving, when are they leaving, and just becoming really data-driven.
Yeah, 100%. I love that you mentioned through the hiring process, because that debunks the pipeline myth. Like, no, people are applying. They're applying. Your recruiters are screening them out. Your hiring managers, because of their biases, they're screening them out. And one other, I think, important thing to do, looking at your employee surveys, your inclusion surveys, looking at those intersectionally. Because I've been at a couple of organizations where they're like, look at our inclusion scores. We're at, 90%. And I'm like, I can tell you without looking at who the 10% is. And sure enough, you start digging into it, and you're like, yep, because your majority population thinks it's awesome. So let's look at this intersectionally and see who's not having a great experience here. And that helps us drive our strategy.
Markus, can you just briefly explain intersectional to those who might not understand what that means?
Sure, multiple dimensions of your identity. So being a woman and a person of color, being LGBTQ. So your different aspects of your identity that come together. I think that's the best definition I've got. Unless someone else is better.
Yeah, love it. Thumbs up. Okay. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. This feels like it's been like 15 minutes. I can't believe we're almost in an hour and a half. Okay, next question from Julia. So we have more people who are interested in this space. Besides training and certificates, what sort of work experiences are helpful in preparing for a DEI role in an organization? Experiences besides training and certification.
I would suggest.
Go ahead, Armond.
I would suggest mentorship. I think identifying a mentor is going to be important, and identifying a mentor that's in the space you want to be in. And it doesn't have to be a VP or CDO. It could be, we have some amazing managers who are doing amazing work. So it doesn't have to be always at the C-suite level. So I think you need to get perspectives at different levels, but finding that mentor who's doing the work that you want to do so that you really understand before you, put your toe in the water, if that's what you're really up for doing.
I was just going to add that I think change management, I saw someone mention that in the chat, is critical to doing DEI work, understanding how to be successful with change. And so if that's some work that you can get into where you are, that's an amazing transferable skill to DEI work.
I'll also add, I know for me, I've done a lot of community service, community outreach, volunteering in different faith, like different interfaith, different communities. And I think the more you put yourself out there to learn about different people's experiences, it'll give you a better lens of what inclusion means and kind of carve out more empathy within you. So my big thing is get out there, outreach, volunteer, engage in the community.
I want to build on that. I came to this work from the community development space. So I was working for a community development loan fund that focused on racial equity. And so there was a lot of work with communities around Wisconsin, working hand in hand, developing a DEI lens in terms of our lending to ensure that the lending that we were doing to our partners was going to have an impact and really advance racial equity in the state. And so, a lot of that work was actually having listening sessions, understanding what the challenges were, understanding how, what the assets in those communities are, right? Not just the needs, but what are the assets? What is it that people bring to the table that we can begin to build, and we can see people and communities as adds, right? And that transfers into the work of DEI. So having, it builds the skills of empathy, which is a soft skill, but a skill nonetheless. We had to do training, certainly analysis, writing, the change management work, I think, is absolutely critical. And being able to build partnerships, effectively build partnerships, both internally, within the organization, and externally, right? So I think all of that work is incredibly important. So if you have those skills, if you're doing that kind of work, all of that work can translate into the DEI space, I think, very effectively.
Well said. Yeah, they call them soft skills, but they can be the hardest to master, can't they? Wonderful. Okay. Gosh, there are so many great people in this. I wish that we could see all the faces of the people. There are so many, thought leaders and practitioners in the chat box too that are just like, oh, here's a white paper I wrote, and here's an article. Just here's a good one, and I'm sure that you've all have some experience with this. So Richard Totten says, how do you manage expectations around new DEI initiatives? Many of the needed changes take time and patience. So how do you get buy-in to make sure that you have success?
I would suggest that you, this sounds, something probably I'm sure we're all familiar with, but make it a SMART goal. Make it measurable, but also make it attainable. I think it was Monica earlier that said, don't try to boil the ocean. Your first year out that you set your goals, don't expect that you'll, knock it out the box on every, goal or every pillar that you set up, but identify those one or two and go deep in those one or two and make them measurable. This is the first time that we have increasing the diversity of talent on our goals this year. And we set a threshold of 3%, a midpoint of 5%, and a max of 7%. So they're not goals that are not attainable, but the goal this year was not so much the number, but getting people into the right behavior to start doing the actions that it'll take. So next year we can aim for 10, 12 to 15%. So it's really, taking those, I said it earlier, those small wins that create trust, that create the momentum. So, don't think you need to do everything, out the box year one, but this is a marathon. It's far from a sprint.
Anyone else on buy-in, making sure that you get the leverage and liftoff that you're looking for?
To add to what Armond said about time, it does take time. I'm really big on finding champions. So when I came in, I tried to align. I met all the executives and I involved them. Like, I asked them to moderate talks. I asked them to be an executive sponsor. I find ways to connect with each one. Again, I know we say this a lot, but meet them where they're at, and find what their passion areas are. So I think that's a big part, because D&I won't succeed at the business if your leaders are not bought in. And so getting them bought in a way that they care about is really key. Having them kick off an event, for example, or, encourage a self-ID campaign. There's so many different ways to encourage leaders. And sometimes it's just about forwarding an email and, thanking them for it. And it goes a long way. So I'm a big fan of finding your champions internally and also ask them to champion to their peers as well.
I love that.
If I can add to that, I would just say that, I think, again, oftentimes I've found D&I leaders do their D&I strategy, what I call on an island. They get in a corner, they get in the office, close the door, and they write out their elegant strategy of what they think should be done in the organization without, as we heard earlier, without anybody else's fingerprints, without anyone else being able to add something. And I love what Sarah said is sitting down and talking with your executive leaders. I'm coming into a new organization right now. The first thing I'm doing is doing meet and greets. I'm sitting down with all of my C-suite, all of my executives, I ask them questions that I know makes them uncomfortable. Like, what advice would you give to someone coming into this role in the organization and things like that? And they're like, okay, but it's allowing them to to be a part of the conversation, to be a part of the solution. And so I think as you're building culture, and I ask questions like, what would you like to see in D&I? What are some concerns you might have as we move this work forward? And you get a chance to address any concerns. You get a chance to allow them to have say and buy-in. So I think those are huge elements to me. Not doing your D&I strategy on an island, but allowing them to have stake in it, to be able to invest in it, because all of those create the opportunity for buy-in.
That's a great point, Art. It was one thing I made clear when I accepted this current role is I'm not interested in standalone D&I strategy. How do we embed the principles of diversity and inclusion within our recruiting strategy? Because we can't have a recruiting strategy and a diversity recruiting strategy. We can't have a retention strategy and a diversity. No, we're going to embed this in everything we do. And all of our people manager learning, it's going to be embedded in there. I don't want a whole lot of standalone content. It's going to be part of what we do. And to your point, how do you get others to take that ownership so that you're not over here and they just point the camera at you when something happens? No, we're not doing that. But this is going to be part of everything we do here.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. If you're on an island, or if it's just accretive to, if it's just an initiative that, it's a start and stop initiative, it's not going to become a part of the DNA of the organization, and you'll just create hypocrisy. It's another one of the, book of the month club, kind of ideas that, didn't really have merit. Oh my gosh, so many more questions. I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my amazing colleague, Danielle Aguas, who is, talk about your 80-20 rule. She's 80% responsible for everything that you saw today. She's behind the scenes. She's the engine, the power. Hi, Danielle. Thank you so much for putting this together. Thank you for the logistics and for your support. And I'm just going to hand it over to you so that you can close and add any more information that you want to provide the people who came today.
Thank you, Sherry. And wow, I really have been a sponge for the last hour and a half. It was hard for me to not want to just stop what I was doing in the chat and commenting and responding to people and just listen, because I just soaked up so much great information from you all. I want to thank you. And for those of you that don't know, my name is Danielle Aguas, and I'm the VP of Client Engagement at Center for Executive Excellence. I work with Sherry. And I really want to thank our incredible moderator and our panelists for an engaging, thoughtful discussion on such an important topic. The fact that you took the time today and tonight, for some of you on the East Coast, took the time out of your packed schedules to share your expertise with us is incredibly, incredibly generous. So thank you. Thank you to our attendees who are still on. And for those that had to leave early, for taking the time out of your day, night, morning, and wherever you are in the world. I know we had a few international people joining us too, but thank you for taking the time to learn more about how to be a practitioner of D&I. So if you can stick around for just 1 minute, I have a few quick announcements for those of you that are still on that may be of interest to you. The first is that today's session was recorded, and both the recording and the chat log will be shared with everybody by email, and I'm hoping by the end of this week. So you'll get both a link to the recording and the chat log from today's session, okay? And I know a lot of people asked that. And I know that also there's a lot of questions that were unanswered, and I'm stewing on ideas of ways to maybe create a LinkedIn group that has all those questions posted, and that gives community members who want to join that group an opportunity to respond to those questions, and maybe even any of the panelists that want to join that group too. Sorry, Sherry, I know that we didn't discuss that, but that's the idea I have, and I'm going to stick with it. So for anyone that wants to join that, I will post a link if you're interested, because there were so many wonderful questions we didn't get to. Tomorrow, let me share my screen real quick. We are going to, sorry, hang on one second. You heard mention of a deeper dive on D&I. And so tomorrow we're going to host a leadership summit to dive a little deeper into this topic. In fact, we're going to have our very own panelist, Hassaine, lead a workshop on starting your D&I journey. You know, whether you're starting from scratch or part of a new internal D&I initiative and you need help, you know, building a solid strategy, she's going to cover a lot of great information for you. We also have a special guest, Terrell Fletcher. He's a former NFL player who will talk about how to make D&I stick and how to close the gap between performative allyship and real change. So if you're interested, this is tomorrow from 8 to 12 Pacific time. We will record it. We will share the recording with those that register. But if you're interested, we're offering 50% off to everyone who's on today's panel discussion. Sherry is going to include the link to register and the code if you're interested. And finally, we're excited to announce that our next quarterly panel discussion will be held on July 28th, featuring these diverse executive women whose stories and expertise can inspire other women leaders and help move the needle for gender equality. We hope you can join us, so please register for this free event, which you can do now by clicking on the link that Sherry should be providing also in the chat box. So this should be really exciting. This is on July 28th. Since we're doing quarterly panel discussions, this will be our next one. So that is it. That's all the announcements I have. Thank you, everybody. Again, thank you to the panelists, to our moderator, and to all of you who joined us and stuck around, especially for the latecomers, or excuse me, for people like Monica and Armond and others that are, it's bedtime, right? Or it's close to bedtime.
Or wine time, whatever.
Or wine time. Thank you, everyone. Be well and have a great rest of the week.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, everybody. That was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm part of the BFF group now, I hope.
Take care.
Thank you, Art.
Enjoy, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.